Hi everyone, I'm Tiffany and I'm working with Jake to do a presentation of a case study of Australian and US media systems and their political communication regarding China from 2022 to 23. I want to start by saying the current world order is being challenged. The US and its allies, including Australia, have enjoyed a stable and prosperous period of growth and relative harmony since the fall of communism in the Cold War. China has experienced exponential growth in its economy and military capacity and has become increasingly willing to challenge the US as the global hegemonic power. This has led the governments of both nations to change their approaches to communicating about China. The presentation will begin by exploring the media systems of Australia and the US, studying the communication from each nation about China to its peoples. We'll then demonstrate how it relates to Andrew Chadwick's hybrid media theory. We're going to have a look at some other theorists and literature to explain the methods used by political communicators in each system. And lastly, some public opinion data we presented from each system to compare and contrast the impacts and effectiveness of political communication on influencing public opinion. So, what's the media system in Australia and what makes it unique? According to Siebert, Peterson and Schramm, Australia aligns with their social responsibility model. But Helen and Mancini, building on their models, put us in their liberal model, which on the surface gives us the same media system as the US. However, our publicly funded broadcasters, concentrated media ownership and political appointments such as to the ABC board, put Australia closer to the polarised pluralist model, but not fully, according to Jones and Pusey, as we don't have a strong tradition of mass circulation of party newspapers or a highly polarised political culture. And it's for these reasons Jake and I are arguing that the US and Australian media systems are different. How does it relate to Andrew Chadwick's hybrid media theory? In his book, he talks about the hybridisation of media and how all our supposedly new forms of media, like social, are recombinations of older media. For example, in social, the term page is used. It comes from the print tradition. He puts that the internet is an extreme form of hypermediacy in action because it's a simultaneous recombination of different media forms. He says, and I quote, and the quote's here, TV retains its primacy in the mediation of politics, though it is now accompanied by a panoply of online media activity, some of it facilitated by broadcasters themselves. The examples he provides are those TV debates between prime ministerial candidates, such as in the UK, where the TV station uses an online aspect such as a poll or Twitter to encourage people to engage online. One of the Australian examples we have is Q&A, the show on ABC, which comes on every week, where there is a form of hybridity that involves political issues and actors, and Chadwick says that this format has become politicised. For our PM Albo and the topic of China, he and his team still use traditional media when they put out media releases. He goes on local radio and he does national press conferences from Parliament House. Then they use social media to amplify that message, and I'll come back to some examples of that. If we look at other theorists, McNair says that a knowledgeable electorate is based on knowledge and information circulating freely and available to all citizens as individuals. But in a democracy, we as individuals act collectively. Our individual opinions combine to become public opinions, directly informing the development and implementation of Australian government policy, ideally. The concept of the information circulating freely in order to form public opinion is referred to as the public sphere by Habermas. Twitter, as a communications platform for political communication, meets some of that definition of making knowledge and information freely available as a distinctive discursive space as defined by McNair. But it does assume equity of access, and as we all know, it isn't necessarily about circulating knowledge or facts. Australian politicians rely on the advice provided by the Australian Public Service, or APS. Mulgan notes the APS aren't neutral because they serve the government in power of the day. Therefore they're providing partisan advice. When it comes to developing a policy position on an issue such as China, the government develops policy based on advice from their APS, stakeholders, their party room and their own advisors. Much of this advice is classified, highly classified. It's not publicly available. Information from the government travels via the media, traditional media, to the general public, and it's one way only. It's not in the public sphere in that it's not open for discussion. There's no disintermediation. It's tightly controlled, and the only forum for debate and discussion is on social media, although it is one way. I'll show soon how that is even not open for a dialogue from our government on this topic. So if we talk about our PM on Twitter, our PM Albanese, or Albo, was very quick after the May 2022 election to come out and talk to the media about China. Just 3 days after the election, The Guardian ran an article citing that Australia will not bend to the demands of China. Arguably, his strong response was to ensure he brought a strong voice to the role of PM as quickly as possible, as is usually the aim in the first 100 days of a new or an incoming Australian government. In contrast, however, he was much slower to use Twitter when talking about China. In fact, he's only tweeted about 6 times about China since coming to power. That's between May and now. The first time he tweeted about China was on 20th of December, and I'll show that in a minute, which was a much more conciliatory message than that of the earlier one of May in The Guardian. To look at China, I also need to look beyond our PM to our Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong. She's also only tweeted 8 times about China since coming to office, quite extraordinary for a foreign minister, and like a PM has taken a positive spin in her comms on Twitter. If we look at the mainstream media's coverage of Penny Wong's visit to China, and you use the relevant keywords under Google News, the visit returned over 74,000 news results, which included global media players such as Al Jazeera, the Wall Street Journal, Sky News, Bloomberg, and various Asian news channels. In other words, as far as the mainstream media were concerned, her visit was big news. In contrast, the same keyword search on Twitter on that visit returned 4 results, not including replies or retweets. It was very limited. That means the nuanced messaging delivered through mainstream is also more likely to influence public opinion. Let's have a look. Simply because it has a greater distribution and reach, a larger, less fragmented audience, and it's, as Chadwick has pointed out, TV particularly has retained its primacy. In line with Chadwick, it's still a hybrid media approach because these mainstream articles are online, and just like catch-up TV, if you miss them live, you can read them online. It's still hybrid and it's still immediate. And you can see in these examples, there are I've highlighted the mainstream media stories with some blue text, and the other elements are Twitter. And there's a lot of retweets and favouring, but when you look into the Twitter examples, there's not a lot of responses. I think the difference for the Australian government between social and mainstream media on the topic of our relations with China reflects the complexity of our relationship. In terms of our recent history politically with the previous government, where it became very strained, compared to this government, who wants a more nuanced relationship. They've been much more careful. I think in this context, traditional media allows for that more nuanced messaging rather than Twitter, which has been used here just as an announcement platform, almost more of a PR headline. So in terms of political communications, this isn't about online activism as much as it is about ensuring there's space for more complex messaging. So in terms of influencing public opinion, whilst Twitter might work as an announcement platform, given the topic of China, the Australian government has used mainstream media, press conferences, big articles, much more engagement. There's a video on Twitter to ensure that the messaging is much more nuanced when it's going out to a public audience if they want to influence public opinion. And that's it from me, so I'm going to hand over to Jake now. Thank you.
My name is Jake Badior, and I'll be presenting about the United States media system and communication by President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken regarding China. The political media system of the United States can be explained using Hall and Mancini's framework for comparing and classifying media systems. Application of this framework to the US media system shows that the US has the most highly developed mass media in the world. However, traditional media consumption is in decline. Political parallelism in the US is rising in alignment with deep divisions in society. Journalistic professionalism is strong in the US, although journalists are increasingly faced with declining levels of public trust, increased polarisation, and pressure to remain relevant in competition with other organisations. Holland suggests the state has a limited role in the US media system. Trust is declining, however, with just 18% of people believing the media was free from political influence in 2022. I agree with Hall and Mancini's assessment of the US media system as best reflecting their liberal model, which is characterised by a free market and dominated by commercial media. This is supported by Jensen and Helles, who say the US media system is characterised by limited support for public service media and few opportunities for public funding. For example, there are 176 media companies and news outlets in the United States. Of the top 50, just 2 receive government funding and just 7 corporations own more than half of the daily newspapers throughout the United States. Concentration of media ownership in the US is similar to that in Australia. In contrast, however, Australia has much higher levels of trust in its public broadcasters, with ABC and SBS ranking first and second respectively in 2022. Again, in contrast to Australia and our low levels of polarisation, the US was classified as severely polarised in 2022 by the Edelman Trust Barometer. Government messaging in the United States was delivered across different channels which required content to be adapted to suit a process known as media logic. The White House issued 10 statements of media releases, 1 speech and 3 press briefings related to China in 2022. This led to strong representation by traditional media, with more than 6,500 results for content regarding China on the New York Times online portal for the year ending March 23, and more than 200,000 on the Fox News site. On Twitter, US President Biden tweeted about China 14 times from January 22 through March 23, whereas Secretary of State Blinken was slightly more active in communicating about China with 16 tweets during the same period. Secretary Blinken's language is also indicative of the media logic approach, using simple language to communicate complex government policy through social media. It is important to understand why leaders chose to utilise the Twitter platform when speaking about sensitive national security matters. This can be achieved by analysing the US media system through Andrew Chadwick's hybrid media theory. Andrew Chadwick's hybrid media system theory is about understanding how and by whom communication occurs. The hybrid system draws attention to change with the passing of older cultural and institutional norms with the gradual emergence of new norms. The nature of news delivery and consumption in the United States has changed dramatically over time, with some scholars arguing this has also changed how people learn about political and current affairs. In 2008, all major news producers in the United States moved to a more hybrid model by increasing the amount of content disseminated online. By 2022, social media was a main source of news for 50% of US adults, with TV declining in importance but still accounting for 50% of main news consumption. Research has also shown that 69% of American Twitter users get news on the site, and that consumers generally trust this information. The United States, therefore, has a strong hybrid media system, perfectly demonstrated by Newman and others at the bottom of this slide. The government is seeking to maximise its reach while utilising other tools necessary for communicating its policy positions on China. Here, I would like to link US political communications with other relevant theory. McNair says governments use the media to influence public opinion on foreign policy issues. This can be linked with agenda setting and priming. The agenda is influenced by the media and political actors telling people what they should be thinking about, and priming occurs when communications content influences what audiences use to evaluate the performance of leaders and governments. Agenda setting and priming are linked with the psychology of information accessibility and retrieval. By making issues more salient in people's minds, agenda setting, politicians shape how people think when making judgments about political issues, priming. US government strategy is to invest, align and compete with the People's Republic of China, which Secretary of State Blinken has communicated in both long form but also as simple, digestible and memorable infographics via Twitter. This strategy can also be linked with the selective perception model and cultivation theory, which posit that consistent exposure over time can be effective at influencing people and changing perceptions. As stated by McNair, this assists governments to influence public opinion in their favour. To begin to understand effects on public perception, consider that public opinion of China has been in a state of decline in both Australia and the United States since before the COVID-19 pandemic. A study conducted by the Pew Research Center showed that 2 major concerns among US adults influencing their views on China were policies on human rights and power and influence as a threat to the United States. Both influenced a downward trend in attitudes towards China between 2020 and 2022. As we can see by this table, 82% of Americans had a negative view of China in 2022. And although there is a slight variation, Gallup also reported that 79% of Americans had a negative opinion of China in 2022. Public perceptions of China in the US are similar to Australia, with a 2022 Lowy poll revealing that just 12% of Australians said that they trusted China. I would like to conclude by posing these 5 discussion questions to the group. We look forward to your responses and thank you for your attention.